I think I'll start. Let me tell you a bit about myself, just to get us warmed up. My name's Holly Cummins. I work for IBM. I've worked for IBM my whole career, pretty much since I left academia. The great thing about working for IBM is, you can stay working for IBM, but you can work on lots of different things. And so, in my time with IBM, which is longer than I'm going to say, I have worked on quite a few different things. But what I'm working on at the moment is WebSphere. And in particular, I'm a developer on the WebSphere Liberty profile. I don't know, have any of you used Liberty profile? One little hand. We've got a sort of an unofficial logo for Liberty, which is I Heart Liberty, because we really are very proud of what we've done. So this isn't a Liberty talk, so I'm not going to dwell too much on it, but I will take this moment, since it's on the slide, to tell you about it. Because what we've done is we've made a version of WebSphere which is incredibly light and incredibly fast, incredibly small footprint, incredibly enjoyable to use, lightweight, configurable. It's a really lovely product. I don't just do Liberty Profile, though. I'm also a committer on the Apache, for Apache. And in particular, I work on the Apache Aries project. And that's an enterprise OSGI implementation. Now, are any of you using OSGI? One hand. So I have written a book on enterprise OSGI. So should any of you wish to know more about enterprise OSGI, you can go buy the book. That's actually nothing to do with this talk at all, but I'm not tired of saying I've written a book, so it's on the slide. So what I am going to be talking about today is the cloud. And it seems like cloud's absolutely everywhere these days. 30% of IT expenditures on cloud now, and that number is just going to go up and up and up. But what is cloud? When I say cloud, well, it seems like such a stupid question, right? Because this is a developer conference. Of course, we all know what cloud is. We don't need an introduction to cloud. Well, yes and no. A lot of the things now, when we say, "Oh, this is in the cloud," 5 years ago, we might have said it's on the internet. And in some cases, what's going on hasn't changed that much, but the terminology has changed. But there are some areas where actually how we work, how we entertain ourselves, what we do, that is really different than how it used to be. So I can't speak to any personal experience of this, but I have been told that 18-year-olds, they don't think about owning physical music anymore, and they don't even really think about owning a piece of digital music. What they think about owning is the right to download that music. And even that, is something where they may not even be bothered about the rights to the music at all. All they care about is whether they have the music right now, because it's streaming to their device or something like that. So I have coined the term music as a service, MaaS, for this. There's other areas as well, though, which are perhaps more applicable to us working in IT. So, a lot of us now, we store only a really limited kernel of things on our laptops, and the rest of it is out somewhere in the cloud. I have a problem on my laptop because in IBM we use a messaging system called SameTime, and it stores your contacts centrally in the cloud. And about 8 years ago, I changed my machine to Japanese to do some internationalization testing. And it changed it, it noticed, oh, this is a Japanese machine, I better change, the status messages and everything like that to Japanese. So it changed it to Japanese and it pushed it up to the cloud. But obviously, it only had that change for when you changed away from the default language. So I changed back to English once I figured out how to change my machine back to English, which is another story. And it didn't push an update to my status. So that was fine. And then I changed laptop, and everything came down from the cloud to my new laptop, including the Japanese status message. And then I changed laptop again, and I've got my beautiful Mac now, and it's got my Japanese status message. And I think there's nothing I can do because there's this sort of cloud storage which is following me around from machine to machine, which thinks I'm Japanese. That's an aside. when we think about cloud, a lot of, we sort of, the sort of consumer-oriented view of it is mostly storage as a service. And so we think of it, as storage, that's something that's remotely accessible. And we probably think of maybe centrally managed and that kind of thing. But that's not, that's not necessary. So we have this idea of a cloud, the Western digital my cloud. And a lot of the things that we think go with the cloud, like being centrally managed and that kind of thing, aren't at all true for this box thing. It's just a box. You buy it, and it gets delivered to you, and then you set it up, and you've got your my cloud, but it's only yours. And it really is all about the storage in that case. For us, I think that's probably not what we think about when we think about cloud. That's not the sort of cloud that's most useful to us. And in the industry, that we're sort of crystallizing on a language now that we use to talk about cloud. And we've got these layers, and we've got the terminology. So the bottom of the pile is infrastructure as a service. Next up is platform as a service. And then finally, at the top of the stack, we have software as a service. And I'll come back to these terms and what we mean by them in a bit. But of course, we're software engineers, we're lazy, so we don't like to say all those words. So we abbreviate it to SaaS, PaaS, and IaaS. What's SaaS, PaaS, and IaaS? Well, IaaS is the computational power. So that's the things, the computers, the hardware, the bits that go along with the computers, perhaps like the network infrastructure, the cabling, firewalls, that sort of thing. And we've seen such a shift, such a transformation, really, in the last few years for this. So when I first started at IBM, I had my laptop, and then I had a desktop. And then as soon as I figured out the little power structures that enabled me to get another one, I got another desktop. And so I had these 2 desktops, and that showed I was a little bit cool. And my colleagues who were really cool, of course, they had 4 desktops. And then there were some empire builders who'd really figured out the system, and they had even more. And we moved desk a lot. And every time we moved desk, we had to lug all of these desktops with us. And of course, they were, in order to be useful to us as servers, they had static IP addresses. And every time we moved desk, we moved subnet. And then we had to change the IP address of all of these boxes. And it was such a nuisance. And, a few years ago, I sort of looked around and I realized that I, dispensed with my desktops a while ago, and then no one else I knew had a desktop either. And all of us, were just getting these provisioned boxes. When we needed one, we went to a web page, we said, I would like a Red Hat system to, test this out. I would like, a SUSE system. And it just, within 2 minutes, we had the system, and that was that. And it just made life so much easier. And it saved, probably the IBM chiropractors so much money as well. So there you have the IBM desktops. And internally we had this idea, the web page, we just provisioned it. But that same model has become available externally as well. So you can go to a web page and you can say, I would like to run my business on, and perhaps I'd like, 1 core, 2 cores, I want to pay this much. And, you hand over your credit card, and then somewhere off in a data center, this computer has magically appeared. And, that's kind of cool. So what about PaaS? Well, even with IaaS, it saved us an awful lot of work. But once we got a significant estate of these machines, even though we didn't actually have to lug around the hardware or, do the installation of the operating systems or that kind of thing, they still became an awful lot of work once we had enough of them. We had to try and figure out what our estate was. We had to manage the installation of the application servers, and then maybe we had some other middleware. Did we want messaging engines? All of these things. How did we keep the configuration the same on all of them? It still started to become an awful lot like hard work. And so now we're moving into this PaaS model as well, where instead of just having, the hardware, you get the things that you need in order to run your application. So what I've got here, there's a few models coming out in this space. I've got a screenshot from IBM Bluemix, which is built on Cloud Foundry, and I'll come back to both of those. But I think the important thing to take away here isn't the details of the technology. It's that what you sort of have is you have this it's almost like a candy box. So instead of you going away and downloading stuff, you can just say, I will have rapid apps, and I would like some monitoring, and you just go click, 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 and there they are. And with the runtimes, it's even easier, because you don't even have to specify the runtime. You don't have to say, in most cases, I want to run an application server. You just give it your application, and it goes, I see you've got some JavaScript there. Let me fire up this for you. Or I see you've got Java. And it takes care of so much for you. So what about SaaS? Well, when I started writing these slides, I was thinking that SaaS is very nice and it's worth including, but it's not something which is perhaps so relevant to us as developers, because we care a lot. Well, we try and avoid caring a lot about infrastructure, but it helps us when someone takes care of it. And the same with the application servers. The stuff that's on top, that's often the stuff that we're writing ourselves. We're not necessarily consuming it from someone else. But even with SaaS, actually, things are changing. So there's some, the really famous SaaS providers, things like Salesforce.com, that have been around for a while. Certainly, I have never had cause to use them not managing a Salesforce. Maybe some of you have. But then there's the other ones that, we probably do use all of the time, like Google Documents. Sort of relevant to development, sort of not. But actually, IDEs seem to be at least partially moving into the cloud. And this is something that, we've been talking about for a long time. So there's Eclipse Orion, which is, has been out there for a while. But I think maybe things are changing that, now that is starting to get traction, and, maybe we are going to move in that direction. So there was a talk yesterday on SaaS IDEs. And the big advantage of that is it means that if you want someone to get started on your project, they don't have to spend time, getting their IDE set up, getting their development environment set up, downloading all the dependencies, figuring out whether they work on their laptop or not. They can code, and then they can, push, and it's done. And when you think about it, our code lives in the cloud, our build lives in the cloud. So it kind of makes sense that actually maybe we should develop, that in the cloud rather than having to pull everything down locally. So I've got here again, this is a screenshot. It's a companion to Bluemix, which is called Jazz Hub, and it's got the IDE, so you can integrate your edit your code, and that's on the web. Well, with all of these things, there's a bunch of competing implementations, a bunch of competing styles of doing that. How many of you were in Andy Piper's? I was about to say Andy Piper's talk yesterday, and then I realized I didn't narrow it down at all. How much of you were in Andy Piper's Internet of Things talk yesterday? A few of you. Because one of the things he said, which has been said before, but it's worth saying again, is that when a lot of these technologies are competing, the one that wins is the open one. Openness really makes a difference. Open wins. And so we're sort of starting to crystallize a bit on an open cloud architecture. So what we've got at the bottom is OpenStack, which, as the name implies, is open. And so, this is sort of doing a similar thing to things like VMware, but it's a fully open implementation. At the PaaS layer, there seems to be a lot of momentum building up behind Cloud Foundry. At the SaaS layer, again, when I first looked at this slide, I thought, well, openness doesn't make so much sense for SaaS, because SaaS, that's the top of the stack. That's where the proprietary value add is. But actually, the proprietary value add still has to be delivered to you by some mechanism, and that mechanism has to be open. So a lot of the SaaS apps, they come to you by the web, and so then they're relying on something like HTML5 in order to give you a good user experience. We think of SaaS as always being something that you access in the web, but that doesn't actually have to be the case. You can get rich clients as well. So a lot of these service-style applications you can access with an Eclipse plugin instead. And there's sort of a few little add-on technologies as well in the PaaS layer that are enabling a lot of stuff. So stuff like Git, stuff like Chef, Mongo, because it's open and cool. MQTT, because it's open and cool. See, it's the theme. But let me come back to Cloud Foundry. How many of you have heard of Cloud Foundry? cool, most of you. I mean, I think it's sort of, it's getting hard not to be aware of Cloud Foundry now, because it's sort of building up this ball of support behind it. So Cloud Foundry, it wasn't when it started out, but what Cloud Foundry now is a foundation, in the same way that Eclipse is a foundation. So it's a shared trust within the industry. And this is sort of the laundry line of sponsorship, and you can see, if you were very patient and you counted, you could see that there's 34 companies who are putting themselves behind Cloud Foundry. And some of these, are big companies as well. And, companies like, VMware and IBM and SAP. So it's got a lot of friends, and it's got a lot of momentum, and it's got a lot of buy-in. So having said that, well, what does Cloud Foundry do? How does it work? What would you get out of it? How many of you have tried Cloud Foundry? 3 hands. So I'll come back to that in a moment. But what Cloud Foundry does for you is, I saw a description and it said it's like Install Shield for applications. So the idea is that you just give it your application and it goes. And how do you do that? Well, this is the classic Cloud Foundry command, which is cf push. And you may be looking at that and you may be saying, yes, that's very nice, but what about the 16 other commands you executed beforehand and the 32 commands you put in afterwards? Well, it really is that easy with some qualifiers. So in order to demonstrate that, I will do a demo. I have such a horror of demos. And so I saw the schedule and I looked and I thought, it's on Friday the 13th and I'm doing a demo. What could possibly go wrong? But then, it's a fairly small demo, because again, that my aim here isn't really to, do a long demo, it's just to give you a flavor of it and then to go on to talk about other things. So I've got my small little demo and I practiced it and I practiced it and it worked really well. And then about an hour ago, I was looking at the web page and I noticed this small little type that I hadn't noticed before that said, scheduled outage, Friday the 13th, 9 a.m. to 11:30 p.m. Eastern time. And I thought, oh. And I had resisted the temptation, because I was going to tweet and I was going to say, my demo really is foolproof. And then I would have felt really, really stupid. So, I always, before I do a demo, I put in lots of qualifiers saying, well, I thought it was going to work, but please don't be surprised if it doesn't work, because I have bad luck. And this time I thought I wasn't going to have to put in those qualifiers, but I'm going to have to put in the qualifiers. So we'll see how far we can get. When I tried it, it seemed to be up, but it might be that it's going up and down. So what I'm going to show is I'm going to show Bluemix again. And the reason I'm showing Bluemix is partly because it's quite cool and IBM do it. But also, it's IBM's implementation of Cloud Foundry. So IBM is providing you, the Cloud Foundry APIs and everything like that, and it's implementing it as a service. And so this is in beta now, so it's completely free. Anyone can sign up. You can go away. You can, try it out. You can stand up your applications. You could run your business on your applications, although I think they probably don't recommend that for various reasons, one of which is there's a little bit that says, by the way, if you want to keep your data, please do come talk to us, because this is just a beta and you're just trying it out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an application. And one of the ways, it's designed really so that you can just get up and going fast. So one of the ways they've done that is they've got these boilerplates that fill in a lot of the application for you. But I'll just scroll down as well, so I'll show you a bit. So you can see you've got a couple of runtimes. This is the Liberty runtime that I was mentioning earlier. It's absolutely perfectly suited for cloud, so it was a really natural fit. And there's a bunch of services as well that you can have. At this resolution, you have to scroll down for quite a while, actually, to get to the bottom of the list, because there's a lot of services that you can use. And the idea is that you deploy the services and you use it in your application. And part of the value of Cloud Foundry, what it's doing for you, is it's wiring in your services to your application. So instead of having to faff around trying to configure the connection to the database, you just say, I've got a database. My application uses a database. Please, sort it out. Get them to talk to each other. So I'm going to create an application, and it's going to have Liberty in it, and it's also going to have a database. And notice that it just says SQLDB. It doesn't give you any more details about what kind of database it is. And this is kind of funny because, IBM has a number of excellent databases, and, this is hosted in IBM, so why wouldn't it say? But, by the way, we're giving you the great, DB2. If you sort of look at the details, it does actually say it's DB2. But the point is that it's generic. The point is that, you shouldn't have to be really coupled to the details of it being DB2 because what's getting provided to you is a platform as a service. And in order for that to be valuable, you want to be insulated from the details. You just want to say, look, SQL database, make it work. So I'll click Create Application. I will choose a name. I will click Create. And so this takes a little while. And of course, in demo time, a little while sort of stretches into this eternity. But actually, when you think about what it's doing, it's not too surprising that it's taking a while, because what it's doing is it's setting up a whole environment for you. It's doing the routing. It's standing up a server for you. And I think when we use things on web pages, we expect them to be instantaneous. So we say, click. Job done. But we wouldn't normally, or certainly a few years ago, we wouldn't have expected to do this kind of thing by a database. We would have instead expected to go and do it by hand, and it might have taken half a day, perhaps even longer to get this sort of environment stood up. She says, wait. There we go. So the application is staging. So if I click on this link now, I get a 404 because it's still coming up. And so if I go back here, you can see I'm getting the monitoring. So it told me my application isn't running. Don't bother clicking on the link. But it will be coming up now. And so now I've got a notification saying, hooray, it started. So now if I go back, and if I do a proper refresh, then I've got a little application. And so if I say, hello DevOps, then I can add that. And this is real as well. So if I disappear for a moment, if I get my phone out, you can do the same, should you want to. So the URL is hellodevox.ng.bluemix.net. If I spell it correctly on my phone, then I can access it. So now if I go back here, I should find that all my content has disappeared, which is a bit impressive, because what I was hoping to do was add a line of content. But Friday the 13th. I don't know if any of the rest of you tried it and saw something different on your phones. Let me try refreshing on my phone again. Nope, it has gone from both. Right. Third time lucky. Try again. Right, so leaving aside a few minor technical details, which worked perfectly beforehand, I can assure you. You know, you can still see it's still kind of cool, because what I've just done in what felt like about an hour, but was actually only about 3 minutes, was I've stood up an application, I've got the routing, you know, it's publicly accessible, so you can access it in this room, but you could also go home and, you know, log in and try it, you know, people wandering by the street, you know, they could use this application as well. You know, I don't think I'm gonna make an amazing business with this specific application, but it's still kind of cool. So what if I want to change it? Well, that's pretty easy too. So I'm getting to the CF push, by the way. So if I look at my application, I can add a Git integration. And so it had cheated slightly because it had given me a boilerplate. But now what it's doing is it's pushing that boilerplate out to Git for me. So I now have a Git repository. And I can copy the URL and go to the command line. And it will pull it down. So you can see this isn't actually on GitHub in this particular case. It's on jazz.net. Are any of you using Jazz or RTC? No, it's the rational. I was going to say IDE, but that's actually not at all the right word for it, because it's an IDE, plus it's got the source control, plus it's got a continuous delivery, and what we're doing now as well, that's all sort of, a client, but we're pushing that out into the web as well, so as DevOps services. So the idea is that you could have your infrastructure hosted on jazz.net, and then, your Git would be hub.jazz.net. So I've got my source here. And I can change my application. So if I change to, what did I call it? Hello Devox. You can see I've got a pretty standard war there, including a built artifact. And if I can change the title. It is amazing how difficult it is to type in front of an audience. Right, so I've done that. It's given me an Ant script as well, so I can kick that off and do a build. And then now I'm ready to do the Cloud Foundry bit, because now I've just rebuilt it locally, but what I want is I want it to be running on the cloud. So I can do CF login. And so it's populated for me where it thinks my cloud's going to go, but I can log in. Now, having said that about typing in front of an audience, passwords is the absolute worst, because of course the audience isn't seeing the password to point out the really stupid typo that you did. Right, try that. Hooray! Right, so now it's got itself all set up. It knows where it wants to push this application. And so now I do the magic CF push. And this is the sort of the bit of magic underneath the covers that makes it happen, which is that manifest file. And so that's giving it a bit more information about what kind of application it is, what sort of SLA I might expect. So now it's going to bind in my services. So this is the bit that I was talking about before, where you've got things like an SQL database, but I haven't specified any details. I've just said I want an SQL database, and it sorts out the bindings. While this works, are there any questions at this stage? Yeah. Yeah, so you can get a few different models. So what I've just shown is I've shown pushing it locally up to the cloud. But of course, that's not necessarily the only model that you want. And in fact, that's probably not the model that you want. That depends on my laptop doing the push. So you can get a bunch of different kinds of integration. So I'll show you in a moment. There's sort of another model as well, which is that I just do a git commit. And then from there, it recognizes the commit, it does a build, and then it does a deploy, and it will do a deploy if the tests are green. So you do get that kind of continuous integration model as well. But in a way, it's sort of better for a demo because it's perhaps more like what your production flow might be like, but in a way it's less good for a demo because it's not actually just you typing CF push and having it go out to the web. Was there another question as well? Okay, cool. So while I was answering that, it's done a bunch of things. So this uploading droplet it's packaged up the whole runtime environment and it's pushed it out to Hello Devox ng. And what's happening here is that starting. Again, that seemed to take a while, but what it was doing was it was bringing up a whole application server, and usually that takes 3 lines. Friday the 13th, it took 10 or 11 seconds instead, but it still brought up the whole new application pretty fast, really. So now, if I go back here, and if I do a proper refresh, I've got Hello Devox. So that was from my laptop to visible to the whole wide world, again in about 5 minutes. And I'll show you just a little bit of the development environment as well. So this comes back to the idea of the SaaS development environment as well as the more continuous delivery model. So if I click on Edit Code, which is where I am, you can see I've got my source in here. I could click on the license, and then I could fill in the license and that kind of thing. And then there's options for build and deploy. So I can configure whether I want it to be an out build, a Maven build, that kind of thing. But I will pop away from that again and go back to... Because what I've just shown is very much public cloud. It's so public that I don't think there's really very much security involved at all, because it is just a little demo environment that I've set up. Is that the only model? Of course not. A lot of us are looking at private clouds as well. And which is better? Well, who do you ask? So I have taken a screen capture of an earlier Devox talk from Devox Belgium. And this is Nicolas. And in his slides, he says private cloud is nonsense. And I really liked that hyphen, because I wasn't sure if that was just because English wasn't his first language, or if he, was actually trying to express what I think he was trying to say. It's actually basically an oxymoron. The whole idea of the cloud is that it's public and that you're not managing it. Why would you do it privately? But of course, that's not the only opinion. If you ask Martin at the pub, as I did, his view is, it's got to be private cloud. Public cloud is just crazy if it's for something like your business. Well, can they both be right? They're both smart guys. Well, the ultimate cop-out answer, it depends. So, and part of the reason it depends is that our definitions of private cloud and public cloud are actually pretty variable. So one person will tell you, you've got to use private cloud, and the other person will say, you've got to use public cloud. And they may actually be talking about the exact same model, but the language is a little bit different. So we've got this sort of spectrum of privacy. So obviously the most public is off-premise, public hardware, public network. A little bit more private is where you've got software giving you some layers of privacy. So you've got the software partitioning to keep your data separate. You've got a VPN to keep your data private in traffic. The next layer down from that, which gives you pretty good security really and privacy and coziness, is bare metal provisioning. And so that's something that not all of the IaaS providers can give you, but certainly some can. For example, SoftLayer, which is IBM's IaaS, does give you bare metal provisioning, and it takes a little bit longer to set up. So you go to the web page and you click your little sliders, and then you hand over your credit card, and it does well. It's actually it's going to be about 2 hours, but that's because it's not just spinning up a virtual machine. It's an actual box somewhere that has to get everything plugged in. Another interesting model that we're seeing is this idea of community hardware. So the idea is that we want a private cloud, but we still want those economies of scale that come with a public cloud. So let's get together with a bunch of our mates, and make a cloud. And in this case, Mates is probably something like the other banks. So in one of the provinces in China, all of the banks have gotten together and they've created this sort of shared infrastructure so that they can have, all of those economies of scale, but without actually that sort of nasty, icky feeling of being on the public hardware. Getting more private still, although again, with all of these, depending how you jiggle them around, you might disagree with their placement. You can have dedicated hardware, but it's still off-premise. So, it's in a data center somewhere, but you're the only person, who's using that hardware. And you paid and put in the hardware yourself. Getting more private still, you could have a dark fiber network. So, your data isn't going over the public network. And then finally, the most private is your on-premise, you haven't even outsourced the management of it, you manage it all in-house. So for my purposes, I have drawn the line between public and private here. So when I say private, I mean, this kind of thing. When I say public, I mean that kind of thing. Well, what's the advantage of public cloud? Well, by definition, public cloud is wonderful because someone else does the work. So it allows us to focus on the things that we really care about, like writing code, and we don't have to be worrying about these sort of system details. And this is good because we are lazy. But it also has business advantages as well. So, say you get this amazing idea, you don't want to then spend the next 2 weeks setting up your data center, provisioning not provisioning the hardware, but purchasing the hardware, getting it all sorted out. You want to hit the ground running, and that's really the thing that that public cloud allows you to do. And so that means that you can innovate rapidly, and that makes good business sense. Public cloud has some other advantages as well. So, can anyone guess what I'm trying to represent here? Amoeba? So what I'm trying with my very bad... Yeah, exactly. I've written down elasticity, but it's the exact same idea. That, you've got your great idea, you put it out, it takes off, and so you need to get more capacity in quickly. You can do that, and then everyone realizes that your idea actually wasn't that good at all, and they go off to the next big thing, and you're not paying for that capacity that you don't need. So that that does make good business sense as well. So with the public cloud, we have this speed and this scalability, and that's good. And another way of thinking about it, in the business terms, is what that enables is agility and efficiency. And those are clearly good things. So, fabulous. Would there be any reason not to use public clouds? Well, yeah. I think sort of as a general trend, we probably are moving more in that direction. And I think some workloads that we would consider it inconceivable to put on a public cloud now, maybe in 5 years, we'll find that they're on a public cloud because we're more comfortable with the idea. But, there are clearly some workloads that if you went to, your business management and you said, I've got this great idea, we're going to put this out on the public cloud, you'd have to scrape them off the ceiling because it's just, it's mission critical. It is not going to be acceptable to take this core part of your business and just send it all away. And, we tend to think of the cloud, and especially when it's a public cloud, we think of it as this sort of, amorphous thing. And we don't think of it as anything that's actually physical, but of course it still is physical. And it still does have power cables going into it, and it still does have, natural disasters potentially occurring. And this means that even a public cloud can go away, which is a bit sad. And even if you don't get something as dramatic as an outage, the physical constraints still do matter. So, when you're the only one running on your virtualized hardware, life is pretty good. As load increases for you, load may be increasing for other users of that hardware as well, and then all of a sudden you've got a lot of contention. And this is known as the noisy neighbor problem. And so, the system capacity, we have this illusion of infinite capacity with the cloud, but it's not true. And again, this comes down to your SLAs with your providers. Hopefully this won't be an issue, but you need to think about it. So can anybody guess what this one is about, looking at the date? Yeah. Can anyone guess now? Yeah. So again, when you've got these systems, you need to have a lot of trust that the person who is maintaining those systems is going to patch them and keep them as secure as you would like. And that, again, is something that you need to discuss with them. But having said that, there's no guarantee that the public providers are all going to patch Heartbleed after 2 weeks, and you would have done it within 30 seconds in-house. There's a lot more to security than just this sort of in-house, off-site division. Because even if you have the most private cloud in the world, if it still has network cables going into it, then the physical location isn't actually the most important thing about its security. The security is about the policies of who has access, rather than the physical location. So you need to think about who has access to the data, how is it separated from the other instances if it's a public cloud, who manages the user IDs, how do the patches get onto it, how do we detect intrusions. And this may be something that a public provider can actually do a lot better than you can do in-house, because they've got more experience in the area, and more focus that they can deploy to it. So as a little example, on Bluemix, one of the services that you can have is something called AppScan. And that, it looks for security vulnerabilities in code as it goes up. And that's something that, you maybe wouldn't have the resources to do internally, but because, it's a bigger provider, that is there for you. But, all of these things, like, we think about security and availability, that actually comes down to trust and control, which really comes down to choose your provider carefully, because it may be that they could do a better job than you could in-house, and it may be that they would do a worse job, but that's something that you need to establish. Well, what about private cloud? Private cloud does come with some challenges. So one of the pieces of work I did recently was the testing for the Liberty integration with Bluemix. And so in the course of that testing, we wanted to have continuous deployment environment, and we wanted that every time, we'd commit the code, we'd spin up a cloud and make sure that build pack worked. And it was really, really hard. And it wasn't just that I was incompetent. Doing things to do with cloud is hard. OpenStack have this really sweet bit on their website that sort of says, good for institutions, maybe not so good, for smaller organizations. And, in a big organization, it can absorb the work for a cloud, if you've got a dedicated IT department and that kind of thing. A smaller organization is vulnerable to being crushed by the cloud. So, when you choose your technology, think about what you can cope with as an organization. Think about how you're going to manage it, what skills you have, how much it's going to cost, security. One thing I would not advise, can anyone guess what I'm driving at here? I would not advise rolling your own. So Cloud Foundry has 707,000 lines of code. And I was in the 50 New Things in Java 8 talk this morning. And so I think that means that Cloud Foundry has even more code than the Java 8 implementation of concurrent hash map. So, it's a serious thing. There's 43 companies contributing code. Another model that we're talking about a lot, and I think this is the way the industry seems to be going, is this hybrid cloud model. So the idea is you maintain both a public cloud and a private cloud. You can have work in both. If your requirements change, if you've got more work than you could do just on your private cloud, you can cloud burst and you can go out to the public cloud. But of course, all of these things have a big assumption, which is they assume connectivity. And a lot of the time that's a valid assumption, but it's not always a valid assumption. So if we are on a desert island, we do not have connectivity. And of course, more is the pity. We're probably not on desert islands all of the time. But we are on trains, and connectivity is fairly limited on trains. And this is the thing that makes me uncomfortable about a strictly web IDE, is that then when you're disconnected, it's not good. And I am with a certain phone provider who shall remain nameless. And we lost our phone and our internet for a month. And I pretty much looked like that picture, because I was so dependent. Almost everything that I did at home relied on having a network connection, and it wasn't there. And no matter how many times we rang support, it didn't come back. And it was absolutely maddening. And again, with cars, we've got the same problem, that on a car, it is a pretty disconnected environment, which brings me back to going berserk. And so really, when we don't have a cloud, when we don't have connectivity, we don't have a cloud. And when we don't have a cloud, we don't have connectivity. It doesn't quite work. So the solution that, we tend to talk about when we talk about these things is offline replication. So that's, you've got your local copy, and then, if you've got connectivity, you can use the cloud. If not, things still work. I'd like to talk about another model, which is wearable cloud. And the reason I'd like to talk about wearable cloud is because I've done a couple of times a talk, because the Liberty profile is so small, and it's got such a tiny footprint. When we first started writing it, then we realized that we could run it on a Raspberry Pi, and we could run it on a phone, and it was really, really cool. And so I did this wearable application server, and I put it in a hat, and I looked absolutely idiotic, but it was kind of a cool thing. And I thought, well, if I can do it with an application server, can I do it with a hat? Can I, can I do it with the cloud? Can I get the cloud in a hat? So I'll take a quick culture break and quote Wordsworth. Just to demonstrate that it wasn't only me who talked about, excuse me, sorry about that talked about portable clouds, because Wordsworth said, "I wandered lonely as a cloud that flits on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, and so I increased my system capacity." So, we've got this model of client-server architecture. And we're having this sort of revolution now where the number of clients is going up and up and up, and the type of the clients is changing as well. So we've got these really crazy clients like toasters and washing machines, but we still have this really traditional model where we've got the one server and it's in the middle and it's connected. So does it make sense to think about an alternative model where you've got a distributed cloud? And half the time I look at this and I think this is the stupidest network diagram I've ever seen. And then the other half, I think, actually, no, it's not that stupid, because we are sort of looking at moving, in this direction to a certain extent. So some companies are looking at pushing the cloud out closer to the user. So they do have, multiple cloud servers, and they're getting, a bit deployed out. And so this brings me back to the portable personal cloud. So I have a confession to make going back to the application server in a hat, which is I wrote the abstract for this talk before I had actually attempted to put a cloud in a hat. And then I tried it, and I realized it really doesn't work even for the purposes of a demo. And the reason has to do with what ARM does and with what cloud providers do. So ARMs, we're sort of looking at these technologies again, and they're actually really, really cool, because they use incredibly low power, and yet you can still do things like running Web through Liberty Profile. Things that ARMs don't do so well is virtualization. So when I wrote this slide, I originally wrote things that ARMs don't do is virtualization, and then I went and looked it up, and I realized that actually ARMs are doing virtualization now, because the idea is that you've got your work phone and your home phone, and you've got these two boxes, very small boxes, that you're carrying around, and that's a bit too much weight to carry. And so the idea is that you can have a virtualized phone stack, and running on the bare metal, you've got your Android operating system, and then you've got your Windows Phone operating system, and you've got your home phone and your work phone, and they're completely separated from each other, and you can just bring up one or bring up the other without actually having to change the physical device. So that's quite cool, and I think it's probably we're going to start seeing that a little bit more on our phones. But I think it's going to take a while longer before we start seeing that pushed into the Cloud Foundry architecture. You can see from this, and it comes back to the 707,000 lines of code. Cloud Foundry is complex, it's big, and it's really, really coupled in lots of ways to your operating system. And it's really coupled to, to having a cloud underneath it. And so it's coupled to the IaaS, and you can swap your IaaS around. You can use OpenStack, you can use, VMware, but it still wants to have something like an IaaS. And to try and get an IaaS to work on a Raspberry Pi, it just doesn't The only way I could make it work was by putting an emulation layer on, at which point I was moving so far from something that was sane or useful that I thought I'd give up. But going back away from Wearable Cloud, I think my point really is that it doesn't actually matter so much whether you're using public or private or Wearable Cloud, because ultimately the important thing is that it's cloud, and that if you focus on the benefits of cloud, then the details of the implementation are perhaps less critical. And you can swap around as well, but perhaps not swap to Raspberry Pi. But within these other options, when you've got the flexibility, that means that you've avoided the lock-in and you can move from your laptop to something like SoftLayer, to something like AWS, and then you can move back as you want. So that really is where I'd like to close. But thank you very much. Oh, I've just been reminded as well, please do vote. And so I don't have time for questions sort of publicly, but I'm up here if anybody would like to come and have a chat.